Hi everyone, I'm Branden.
I'm Lauren.
And I am Seth.
And we're going to tell you about our Literature Circle book, Rhythm and Resistance.
So just a little introduction on our book. Rhythm and Resistance was published by Rethinking Schools in 2015. It offers practical lessons about how to teach poetry through the lens of social justice, how to build community through poetry, construct stronger literacy skills. It reclaims poetry as a necessary part of a larger version of what it means to teach for justice. And this bolded text right here is their mission statement from their website. And during this presentation, we're going to discuss each chapter and the core intentions of the chapter, as well as highlight some of our favorite parts and the biggest takeaways we got from the text.
About the authors, so they are Linda Christensen and Dyan Watson. Both of them are based in Oregon, so a lot of the book is very relevant to the work that we will be doing as educators getting our licensure in Oregon. And they work with Rethinking Schools and are based at Lewis and Clark College.
For key concepts, the way the book and lessons are put together, the main ideas that are being presented and worked on are guiding goals and values of a social justice lens. We have some listed here, but every lesson still uses poetry craft elements as foundational to what's being worked on. It's just that they're used as tools for these broader discussions about identity and social development and building community. So going into the chapters.
So the first chapter in the book is titled Roots. And the first part that the book focuses on in this chapter is the Where I'm From poem by George Ella Lyon. And the reason they start with this poem, I believe, is because it's a really good basis for how to build community in a classroom. And some of the teachers that they spoke with while they were writing this chapter highlighted that this poem really focuses on simple facts that you can put into poetic form and works as a structure for students to kind of analyze and view their own lives and how that aspect can help build community in a classroom. And a couple points that they highlighted as being important that I took away from this chapter is that students don't necessarily have to tell the truth when they're writing their poems. Sometimes their exaggeration or what they said tells you more about who they are and what they believe and how they feel than, the truth might actually. And just in writing this poem and starting off with this, having them focus on metaphors, having them be very detailed and review those details and analyze how they can bring more imagery out in those details, and including sayings from home, things that are personal to them, is really important to you both understanding your students, but also to your students understanding each other. Another important aspect this chapter highlighted was bringing joy into classrooms. Having students share about their own lives and become excited about creating poetry can bring out laughter and noise and voices that a lot of teachers have seen to be, demonstrating their connection as well as just building that connection. Something else, looking for commonalities with your students. Figuring out where we can celebrate both differences and similarities is really important to starting that conversation with them and how we find understanding with each other through poetry. And then one quote that I wanted to pull away that they added to this chapter was from August Wilson. In this culture that stands solidly on these shores today as a testament to the resiliency of the African American spirit. This quote really highlighted some of the aspects that the chapter talked about as being ways to build community and bring the students' culture and lives into the classroom. And that was really the main points I took away from this chapter.
Chapter 2 is Celebrations, and the subtitle is Lift Every Voice and Sing. And the chapter is subtitled after a song that's often called the Black National Anthem. And a quote about that is, "It signifies gratitude for the changes that have occurred, yet mindful that the struggle for justice and equality is not yet over." This chapter helps students reclaim parts of themselves, their experience, and the world that has been tarnished. The chapter is broken up into these sections: praise poems, odes, Aki I Aya; the age poem, celebrating skin tone, celebrating student voice. And each section focuses on a different type of poetry that is a type of celebration or lifting up. And kind of the main grounding of this chapter is reminding students that they have a voice that is beautiful and needed, because so much of the world might tell them the opposite. And using poetry, they are able to do things like praise their skin. They're able to do things like celebrate kind of things that are common or regular, and kind of make them more exciting than they might otherwise be depicted as. And compare, the Aquí y Allá is kind of comparing here and there, which is what that means in Spanish, and being able to compare two different places and experiences between them.
Chapter 3 is called Poetry of the People. The subtitle is Breathing Life into Literary and Historical Characters, and that's really what this chapter focuses on. The idea presented in the introduction is building empathy across identities that often divide, and building empathy across time. So a lot of the lessons in this chapter are under the genre of persona poems, where the students write from a voice that is not their own, either as a real or imagined figure from history or a figure from literature. There are two collaborative lessons in this chapter where the students have to work in partnership with another student to produce a single poem, to sort of bring that idea of empathy across identity into the classroom community, rather than it being in the abstract of the students working by themselves, sort of reaching that consensus with another person and practicing collaboration. My favorite lessons are Learning About Inequality by Linda Christensen. Misspelled "and" here, but we're just going to keep moving. And Brown Doll, White Doll by Shuela James and Heidi Tolentino. These are really similar lessons in that the end product, the end artwork being created, is under the format of a two-voice poem, where there's two personas trading off speaking. And they're really similar on the face of them, but they have different objectives, with the first being focused on inequality in society. The poem that they use as a model is called Two Women, that show the very different experiences of a wealthy woman and a poor woman experiencing the Chilean Revolution and subsequent coup. And then Brown Doll, White Doll is focused on what is often referred to as windows and mirrors in social justice education, about things we share and things that are different, and celebrating all of those things. So celebration, inequality, and I really enjoyed this chapter a lot, and I really highly recommend it.
Chapter 4 is called The Poetry of Protest. And one thing that I wanted to highlight from this chapter that the authors highlighted is that poetry serves humanity, not profits. And they specifically chose authors and poems that should reflect this to students. And one author that they chose to reflect this idea was Martin Espada, because he refused Nike's offer to use one of his poems in their advertisement. And he rejected it for many reasons, but one of the main reasons he rejected it was because of their awful labor practices. And this kind of highlighted the whole idea that poetry is meant to serve humanity. And in reflecting this to students, we can help them see how they can use poetry as a form of social justice and as a form of talking back to the world. So part of the political work of poetry is shaking people awake, making them look at the world with their eyes wide open. That was one quote from the text that I really appreciated. So how can we accomplish this in a classroom? Really by utilizing writers who believe strongly in the ideas that you're trying to convey, and bringing in diverse authors and artists who can give the students examples to look at and view themselves in that aspect and in different ways. So one strategy they employed was asking students to think about whether or not they would take money for using one of their poems in an ad for a company they don't necessarily agree with, and then talking about their ideas and then showing them Martín Espada's poem, and talking about what he did and asking them, would they have done the same? Would it really be a big deal if he had let them use his poem? And then using that conversation to bring in the ideas of social justice in poetry. Another important thing, writing poetry can be brave and can be impactful and can be important, but it is what you make it. And bringing these ideas into the classroom is one way to open up the students' minds. Not only that, but witnessing with your students the injustices of the world through poetry is one way to look at these things that are happening and show them that you don't have to turn your back on this and that we are not turning our backs on you. Because when you're going to bring culture and community into a classroom, you need to also be prepared to address these issues that are going to come up and that are very prevalent in the lives of your students.
And chapter 5, turning pain into power. A quote that I pulled: as students use poetry to forgive or not forgive, or to talk about their fears, they learn that they are not alone. They learn to gather up their emotions into words, to talk back to the pain and give themselves directions for moving on. And that really, I think, summarizes this chapter pretty well. And it's broken down into these sections: forgiveness poems, pain and poetry, knock knock, black like me, and keepers of the second throat. Each section focuses on different ways to realize, process, and share about pain and fears that the writers have, and the commonalities between people, and that you shouldn't let pain and fear hold you back. This chapter was very powerful to me. I think the whole book is, but I cried a lot while reading this chapter because you get to read poetry from kids that is just very powerful and very human. And I think it's wonderful that through the communication tool that poetry is, you can have such community development and see a lot of truth. And that is really used for social justice, which is what this book's about.
And the final chapter, chapter 6, diverges in a pretty significant way from the layout of the rest of the book, in that it has lessons explicitly about the craft elements for composing and analyzing poetry, whereas the rest of the book, every lesson has 2 or 3 elements of poetry craft for students to use as tools to analyze and compose poetry, really key and centered in their process of creating their art. But these lessons in chapter 6 focus on singling out a single one of those core craft elements that are featured throughout the book and working really hard on revising to include those for greater impact in the student's art. So there are lessons on concrete images, on using active verbs over piles of adjectives to give the poem more rhythm and force, line breaks, and there's even guidance on having effective group revision work and how to run an effective community building read around in your classroom so that the classroom community can continue to develop. So there's some really great resources in here, especially if you as a teacher have never run a classroom in this way with these kind of social justice goals. So I learned a lot from this. I even went and revisited some of my own poetry and went, oh my gosh, like the verb lesson. I went back and looked at some of my early poetry and went, oh my gosh, this is so true. This is great. And then at the end, it includes an annotated glossary of key elements that are featured throughout the book to kind of help teachers and students understand these ideas and how they can be used, and an annotated resource list for further reading so you can feel like really grounded in teaching this. As I mentioned a moment ago, my favorite lesson was the one on verb craft by Linda Christensen. It's on page 219. And it's just a really direct, effective way to bring a lot more action and impact into your poetry when you're writing about themes like this. Which brings us to our last slide, our conclusion, where we can share any final remarks that we might have off the cuff. Anybody want to say anything?
One thing I did want to add is that this book is very student-centered in that we get a lot of examples of student work like throughout the whole text. It's really impactful to see, you know, where specifically I'm thinking about with the Where I'm From poems, you could see the original poem alongside the student work and the variations that existed, not just between like each student, but each student's experience and culture and like level of ability. And it was really beautiful to see that all come together in one. And getting some of those examples too really highlights how some of these craft ideas and some of these like different techniques are working. So I thought that was a really beneficial part of the book as well.
Yeah, and I am just very excited to become a teacher so that I can use this resource because I just think it's marvelous.
I absolutely agree with both of you. I've read some other poetry instruction lesson plans and none of them really ever stuck with me. And this is the first resource that really hit me like, yes, this is some really exciting stuff that I'd love to bring into the classroom. And Lauren, you're absolutely right. Almost every lesson starts with a model poem by a professional artist or some renowned voice, but always the models include students from previous classes and previous years that have worked in your classroom. Always. Poetry is never treated as this thing for real artists or pros or something like that. It's always something made personal and available to them. And if you're interested in other curriculum like this, Rethinking Schools has a lot of books out. You can find it at rethinkingschools.org. There's our references. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, everyone.